There's a genetic map inside every Mexican genome, not in the census, not in the surname, not in the language, the religion, or the passport. Only in the DNA, and it predates Spain by 10,000 years. The conquest couldn't erase it. 300 years of colonial rule couldn't flatten it. 2 centuries of a government building a single national identity couldn't dissolve it. It is still there. That is where this story ends. But to understand how that is possible, you need to start with what Spain actually walked into in 1519. A peer-reviewed study in the journal Science described the internal genetic diversity of Mexico's indigenous populations using a comparison that stopped me the first time I read it. They found that the most genetically divergent groups within Mexico are as different from each other as Europeans are from East Asians. Not as different as neighboring European countries. As different as 2 separate continents. And the reason comes down to something so simple it's almost obvious once you see it. Mexico is not one geography. It is a dozen. The Sierra Madre Occidental, the Sierra Madre Oriental, the Sonoran Desert, the Oaxacan Highlands, the Yucatan Peninsula sealed on 3 sides by ocean and on the 4th by rainforest and limestone shelf. Each of these barriers was a wall, not a political wall, a biological one, behind which a population evolved independently for thousands of years. The Seri people of the Sonoran Desert and the Lacandon Maya of Chiapas are separated by roughly the same genomic distance as a Norwegian and a Korean. They are separated by about 2,000 kilometers of Mexican territory. Mexico's landscape did not just shape its history, it shaped its genome. That single geographic fact is the explanation for everything that follows. Before a single Spanish ship appeared on the horizon, between 25 and 30 million people lived inside those geographic walls. Not scattered communities, civilizations. The Aztec Triple Alliance governed 489 distinct communities. Tenochtitlan had a population over 200,000 at a time, when London had fewer than 50,000. The Stanford study I mentioned, 2014, Journal Science, Andres Moreno Estrada and Carlos Bustamante, over 1 million genetic variants across more than 1,000 individuals, found 65 genetically distinct indigenous populations inside what is now one country. 65. Under one passport, one flag, one census category. The map that existed before 1519 was not just a political map. It was a genetic map, written by thousands of years of geographic isolation. And the question that the genetics keep answering, question that the 2026 Nature Medicine paper answered again just 3 months ago, is this: what happened to that map when Spain arrived? Here is what the history books emphasize. Hernán Cortés arrived with approximately 600 soldiers, and within 2 years, the most powerful empire in the Americas had collapsed. What the history books treat as a footnote is the actual mechanism. 600 men did not conquer 30 million people. The disease did. Smallpox arrived in 1519. The indigenous population had evolved in biological isolation from Eurasian pathogens for 15,000 years. Zero immunity, no prior exposure, no partial resistance inherited from ancestors who had survived previous outbreaks. The epidemic of 1519 to 1520 killed between 5 and 8 million people before a major battle had been fought. The epidemic of 1545 killed an estimated 7 to 17 million people in the Mexican highlands alone in 3 years. Within 80 years of first contact, the indigenous population collapsed from approximately 22 million to fewer than 2 million. 90%. Gone in less than a century. I have read that figure probably 30 times while putting this together, and it still does not feel like a number that belongs in a sentence about real human beings. But here is what that number means for the genome. When a population collapses by 90%, the 10% that survives becomes the biological foundation of everything that follows. The surviving women, those who carried some degree of resistance, who lived through epidemic after epidemic, they became the genetic ancestors of modern Mexico in a way that no subsequent history could undo. And the demographic structure of the conquest made this asymmetry permanent. Spanish men arrived. Spanish women, in the early decades, largely did not. Children born to Spanish fathers and indigenous mothers were classified as mestizo, given Spanish names. Baptized Catholic, entered into the colonial administrative record as something new. The colonial project renamed those children. What it could not do, and this is the part the genetics keep proving, is alter the cells they inherited from their mothers. 93% of Mexican maternal lineages, the mitochondrial DNA passed exclusively from mother to child, unchanged, still belong to indigenous American haplogroups. 5 centuries later. The surnames are Spanish. The maternal genome is not. The conquest changed everything visible. The map survived everything the eye cannot see. But here's the finding that I personally think is the most underrated result in the entire field of population genetics. Scientists expected that 500 years of population movement, intermarriage, migration, and mixing would have made the original genetic map of Mexico unreadable. 5 centuries is a long time. The expectation, the reasonable, logical expectation, was that the pre-Columbian genetic structure would be dissolved, washed out, gone. Carlos Bustamante, one of the lead researchers on the Stanford study, described their expectation directly. They anticipated that 500 years of population movements, immigration, and mixing would have swamped the signal of pre-Columbian population structure. It hadn't. Mestizo genomes, people who speak only Spanish, carry only Spanish surnames, have no conscious connection to any indigenous community, track so precisely with their local indigenous neighbors that you can look at the indigenous ancestry segments in a modern mestizo genome and reconstruct which ancient civilization their ancestors came from. A mestizo living in the Yucatan carries Maya signatures. A mestizo from Oaxaca carries Zapotec signatures. A mestizo from Sonora carries the genomic fingerprint of the northern desert peoples. The colonial settlement map of 16th century New Spain and the genetic ancestry map of modern Mexico are, in measurable terms, the same map. Average European ancestry runs approximately 60% in northern Mexico, 40% in the center, 30% in the south, matching almost exactly where Spanish colonial settlement was densest and where indigenous terrain was most resistant, 500 years later. The same map. Here is what I keep coming back to when I sit with that finding. The colonial project was specifically designed to produce one kind of Mexican. The census, the church registry, the naming system, the educational system, every institution aimed at a single, homogeneous Catholic Spanish-speaking identity. And the genome says that project did not work at the level that actually mattered. So let me ask you something directly, and I want to know what you genuinely think. If the most powerful colonial administration in the Western Hemisphere could not erase a genetic map that predates it by 10,000 years, what does that tell us about where the actual limits of institutional power sit? Share your thought in the comments. I have been sitting with that question for weeks. Now here is where the map stops being history and becomes something happening in hospitals right now. In January of 2026, a paper published in Nature Medicine measured something that should be on the front page of every health publication in Mexico and the United States. I am honestly baffled that it isn't. The paper found that the degree of genetic variation between Mexican regions for specific clinically relevant variants is larger than the genetic distance between Europe and Asia as a whole. Not comparable to it, larger than it. 2 Mexicans from different regions of the same country can be more genomically distant from each other for the variants that determine how their bodies process certain drugs than a European is from an Asian. The map that survived the conquest is now producing different drug metabolism profiles in different regions. And the medical system does not know how to read it. Start with fentanyl. The T allele of the CYP3A4 gene, linked to reduced fentanyl metabolism, is carried by 86% of people in Chiapas at least once, and by 38% of people in Chiapas twice. In northern states like Baja California Sur, only 9% carry 2 copies. A standard fentanyl dose calibrated to a European ancestry baseline can be too strong for a patient in Chiapas with predominantly Maya ancestry. Because that patient's indigenous genome processes the drug more slowly, the standard dose in that patient becomes too much. That number, 86%, is not a statistic about ancestry. It is a statistic about surgical risk. Now statins. A variant that hinders statin metabolism is present in less than 1% of Mexicans from northern states, and in more than 15% of people from the Yucatan Peninsula. Mexico has nearly 8 million people taking statins. Poor statin metabolism increases the risk of serious side effects including muscle damage. 15% of people in one region of Mexico may be carrying that risk invisibly, because the clinical protocol classifies them as Hispanic and moves on. And then diabetes. A study analyzing 134,000 individuals from the Mexico City prospective study found that the percentage of inherited indigenous American ancestry is strongly associated with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. A specific variant, SLC16A11, appears at approximately 50% frequency in indigenous Mexican populations but is rare in European populations. Every person with significant indigenous Mexican ancestry, assessed by a European calibrated diabetes risk calculator, may be receiving a systematically underestimated risk score. Why does this variation exist? Because the map survived. The indigenous ancestral groups that shaped each region's genome, Nahua in the center, Zapotec and Maya in the south, Yaqui and Pima and Seri in the north, evolved in geographic isolation from each other for thousands of years, developing different variant frequencies. The conquest layered Spanish ancestry across all of those populations. It did not mix those populations into each other. The regional genetic distinctiveness that the mountains and deserts created before 1519 is still there, still geographically patterned, still producing different clinical outcomes 500 years later. The map the conquest could not erase is now the map that clinical medicine cannot read. The reason the medical system cannot read it is not accidental. It flows directly from a decision made in the 16th century. The mestizo category was not a neutral description. It was a tool created by Spanish colonial administrators as part of the Sistema de Castas, the caste system, to manage a racially mixed population inside a racial hierarchy. Mestizo classified Spanish indigenous mixed heritage for administrative and legal purposes, tax obligations, land rights, professional access. The category existed to flatten difference into something governable. After independence, the post-revolutionary Mexican government repurposed it. José Vasconcelos built the concept of La Raza Cósmica, the cosmic race, celebrating mestizaje as Mexico's defining characteristic and its path beyond the racial divisions of the colonial period. The political intention was different. The effect on the genome was the same. 65 genetically distinct populations compressed under one administrative label. That label, mestizo, or its equivalents Hispanic and Latino in U.S. medical contexts, is now the operative classification in clinical drug dosing protocols, disease risk models, and medical research for Mexican and Mexican-American patients across North America. A category invented by a colonial administrator in the 1500s, repurposed by a post-revolutionary government in the 1920s, is now determining the baseline assumptions in hospitals caring for 170 million people. The map survived the conquest. What the map did not survive yet is the form on the intake desk. Here is what has stayed with me since I read through all of this. The conquest changed the language, the religion, the political system, the surnames, the architecture of every city center, 300 years of colonial administration, followed by 200 years of a government building a single national identity. And the genome kept a different record. 93% of Mexican maternal lineages are still indigenous. The pre-Columbian genetic map is still perfectly legible inside the genomes of modern Mexicans who have no conscious connection to any indigenous community. The continental scale diversity between indigenous groups that existed before 1519 is still there. Still geographically patterned, still producing different drug metabolism profiles in different regions, still larger than the difference between Europe and Asia for the variants that matter most in a clinical setting. Charles II officially banned the Nahuatl language in 1696. In 2020, it had more than 1.65 million speakers. The power to ban a language and the power to make it stop are not the same power. The genome and the language survived by the same mechanism, transmission that institutional authority could prohibit but could not physically interrupt. A grandmother speaking to a grandchild, a cell dividing. Spain renamed Mexico. It did not replace it. The genome kept the original map. Mexico is a country where 65 genetically distinct civilizations still leave their fingerprints inside the genomes of people who have no idea those civilizations are there. Where the Sierra Madre and the Sonoran Desert built genetic walls that 500 years of colonial administration could not tear down. Where a 90% population collapse made indigenous women the biological foundation of a nation that spent 2 centuries trying to define itself as something else. Where the pre-Columbian map is still readable, still geographically precise, still, right now, today, determining whether the standard dose is the right dose. The conquest wrote over the surface of Mexico. The map underneath is still there. You did not choose your genome. Neither did your grandmother. Neither did hers. But every one of them passed something forward that no colonial administrator, no census category, and no medical intake form has ever been able to accurately name. If someone in your life is carrying that without knowing it, and statistically, if they are Mexican or Mexican American, they almost certainly are, this video exists for them. Subscribe. There are more of these stories. The genome does not run out. Thanks for watching.